I moved into a small apartment above a bakery in a neighborhood I had only meant to stay in for a season. It was late autumn, and the smell of yeast and sugar used to drift up through the floorboards every morning. My routine had been precise. Wake, coffee, laptop, reply to messages on that one subreddit where people traded late-night confessions and survival tips, then head to work at the publishing house. Come home, small dinners, a podcast in the hall before sleep, nothing dramatic, nothing worth writing home about, and I liked that about my life. The first oddity was almost laughable because it was so small I almost ignored it. A comment on a thread I had posted about a late-night walk turned up that same evening under a different username saying I should wear brighter shoes. A micro-incident, like a whisper. I remember the ache in my chest when I read it, the way my fingers paused over the keyboard, the battery indicator on my phone blinking amber in the dim kitchen light, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I had always been online, part of several communities. Moderators knew me as someone dependable. Sam had once messaged me about a sticky post, and Jenna, the admin, and Priya had given me tips on digital privacy. But my childhood taught me to keep doors closed and trust few people. A memory that feels like a backstory in shorthand. I grew up in a house where doors were double-bolted, where my father, an electrician, taught me the logic of locks and the sound of a deadbolt turning, where loss came in slow increments. A neighbor moving away, a mother leaving town. Lessons in vigilance taught between chores and homework. Those 3 paragraphs of my life boiled down to one truth I carried into every new place I lived, that safety is mostly routine, and sometimes routine is the only protection you have. My job had been a refuge, and Reddit was an odd extension of that refuge, until the night the coincidences began to snowball. First, I found a printout on the stair landing with the timestamp of when I typically left for work written in thick black marker. 8:07 a.m., as precise as a surgeon's note, and a smell of cheap printer ink that made me dizzy when I crouched to pick it up, the paper's corner damp from the morning dew. Then, Maya, my neighbor, a nurse who worked nights, mentioned over the mailboxes that someone had been asking about my shifts, and said the person had given the excuse of being new to the building, an offhand comment that sent my heart racing like a drum. Conversations that followed were small detonations. I told Alex, a friend from college, about the printout, and he laughed at first, then frowned when I explained there had been more, his voice low over the phone and the sound of traffic behind him. Dialogue in those early days was short and dense, 10 exchanges at least each time we talked. Me saying, I found something else. Him asking what. Me listing details. Him telling me to call the building manager Marcus. Me hesitating. Me imagining the worst and framing it as the most sensible option. I will call Marcus now. You do that. Check the cameras, she said. We should file a police report, I said. Are you sure? He asked. Do it, I insisted, and it felt like we were all walking on thin glass. The pattern hardened into a stalking script. Printed notes, timing, a small plastic bag with my favorite tea left outside my door, a photograph of my shoes taken from the corridor, compelling evidence of tracking. The peephole in my door became a small theater where I held my breath and watched the hall for shadows, checking the deadbolt twice, the click of metal against metal a small partial comfort. I began to imagine the person mapping my life the same way I had once mapped neighborhoods for book research, with careful notes, with a list of routes and habits. And in the early weeks, I alternated between furious and frightened. As the escalation unfolded, it stopped feeling like coincidence. I started to see patterns in detail. There were times when a car would slow at the corner at the exact moment I stepped out of the building, tires hissing on wet pavement, headlights low so I could not read the face inside, and the smell of wet leaves would cling to my scarf like a memory. In the thread where I had first posted a mundane question about noise in old buildings, an anonymous user called Night Raven had replied with a single line describing my street, the bakery, the exact bench by the bus stop. And when I clicked through their comment history, I noticed oddities, deleted posts that mirrored my real life, photos that were cropped close enough to hide faces, but wide enough to show a lamp I owned. I began to follow up on breadcrumbs, and in doing so, I named characters to the story, people who became involved along the way. Officer Ruiz, who took my first call and had a steady voice like gravel. Detective Harris, who later arrived with a skinny notebook and a habit of asking follow-up questions that made my skin prickle. Marcus, the building manager, who kept keys in a heavy ring and who admitted during a tense conversation that he had seen someone loitering by the back door. Jenna, the admin from the subreddit, who sent me a DM saying she had found messages on the forum that seemed to reference me. Sam, the moderator, who archived a suspicious account and sent screenshots. Priya, who offered practical encryption tips, and a neighbor named Lena, who lent me pepper spray and would not leave my side the night I stayed up waiting for a siren that never came. The community online hinged between helpful and complicit in a way that felt uncanny, some users offering advice on how to lock your phone, others posting theories that read like fiction. My investigation turned deliberate. I started to record everything in a spiral notebook, pages filling with times, descriptions, tracks left in the mud outside the back door. The Portuguese word rastros felt apt, though I used the English tracks in reports. I took photographs of evidence and uploaded them to a private folder, labeling them in a way a forensics team might appreciate. Details like print smudges on the paper, the brand of adhesive on the bag, the exact model of the camera one image suggested. My backstory of competency surfaced as I tried to manage logistics, remembering my father's careful hands wiring a circuit and translating that into checking every deadbolt, testing the battery life on my doorbell camera, swapping in fresh batteries and configuring motion alerts to ping my phone. I learned quickly that an attentive person could reconstruct a life online using only the crumbs you dropped intentionally and the crumbs you left unconsciously. I had posted a photo of my coffee mug on a weekend, and someone had zoomed into the background and read a tiny calendar on the fridge with an appointment circled in red. Details that once felt trivial were now instruments in an invasion. The moment of confrontation did not come as a single cinematic reveal. It was slow, and then, suddenly, it was everything at once. I remember the night clearly, the air thick and warm for October, the corridor lights humming, my steps on the carpet sounding too loud, the electricity in my chest like static. I locked the deadbolt and then stood by the closet door listening for any shift in the building's noises. Lena had stayed over, and we had a short scene of 3 rapid dialogues where she insisted, "Please sleep with the lamp on. I am not leaving you alone." I said, "I can do this alone." She said, "No, we will call Ruiz together if we hear anything." I resisted, saying I did not want to escalate. She spoke softer. "Sometimes escalation is safety." I relented and put my hand on the doorknob. Suddenly, the phone buzzed with a message from Sam, who said a user had posted a screenshot in the subreddit that showed a list, 15 names and timestamps. A list titled My Study, and one of the names matched mine, spelled exactly as it appeared in my comment history, and that was the last straw that sent me toward action. I called Officer Ruiz, who answered with that same calm, and Detective Harris arrived 2 hours later with rubber gloves and a flashlight and the kind of seriousness I had only seen on television. We staged a small, sharp sequence of exchanges at my front door, 10 terse lines each, me explaining what I had found, Harris asking about the bag and the prints, me handing over my spiral notebook, him saying we will need to file a police report and register this as stalking, me asking about tracking, him explaining how forensics can extract metadata from images and how detective work will try to connect IP addresses and phone records. The critical incident happened when we finally reviewed footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, the video clip grainy but damning, a silhouette lingering in the corridor at 2:12 a.m., hands in pockets, the person crouching by my door and then standing, and later we matched a comment on Reddit where that same time had been joked about. The sight of a human shape skulking in the hallway flattened me in a way words cannot. My palms got clammy, I tasted copper, my heart thrummed like a trapped animal. Harris guided me through a methodical set of steps that felt clinical and familiar at the same time. He asked me to retrace my timeline for the investigators and to point out anything I had left out, and every time I spoke, I felt memory bloom into sharper form. That night, I slept in Lena's living room with the lights on, the siren from a distant ambulance becoming a thin wail that threaded the windows, and I would not go near my closet door for days. The confrontation had been slow, but it landed like a punch, and afterwards, the investigative phase turned into a technical and legal process that required a steady, almost boring kind of attention. Reporting the incident involved paperwork and specifics, and for once I had to be procedural in public, giving statements and filling out forms, which in English read with blunt clarity as a police report. Detective Harris explained how the department would initiate tracking and coordinate with cyber units to request a subpoena for logs and IP addresses, how forensic analysts would examine the metadata attached to suspicious images and messages, and in about 300 characters of technical explanation, he distilled the bureaucracy into a digestible plan. Forensics will preserve digital evidence, request server logs, and perform hash checks to ensure files are unaltered. Chain of custody will be documented and entries logged. The language of procedure was necessary and oddly comforting. It promised that the chaos could be translated into evidence. Marcus, the building manager, provided access to camera footage and to logs of who had keys and when doors had been opened, and his presence in the investigation felt ambivalent because he admitted that he had been lax about guest lists, and he seemed genuinely surprised at how someone could have exploited that. The building manager Marcus agreed to change the locks and install a secondary deadbolt with a reinforced strike plate, and we watched him do the work while the patrol car idled below with lights off to avoid alarming other residents. Parallel to the institutional investigation, I pursued my own online tracking, and that is where the subplot about Reddit grew dark and complex. The subreddit had been a place where impossible things happened, where accounts could be created and abandoned without consequence. And I found 14 additional posts archived under the same suspicious account, each with a short confession or a detailed list of observations about people they called studies. The username had been deleted several times and resurrected, and Sam, the moderator, provided exported logs showing IP ranges used to create posts, while Jenna, the admin, gave me a copy of the private messages that mentioned me by a nickname I had used years ago in an offhand post. I started to build a profile of the antagonist by piecing together posts and comments, a slow construction of motive and method that filled 2,000 to 3,000 characters of narrative in my notebook, where I hypothesized patterns like an investigator. The antagonist seemed to derive pleasure from cataloging lives, from making lists, from the precision of knowledge. They had left notes matching my schedule and small gifts that were not meant as kindness, but as signals of presence. And the more I dug, the creepier the picture got, because there were at least 15 names on that list, people who had posted in that same corner of Reddit and who later mentioned being followed or receiving anonymous packages. And the evidence suggested a wider pattern, not a lone obsession. This subplot unfolded across weeks and involved at least 5 to 8 secondary voices who offered corroborations, from a woman named Rachel who received a similar bag outside her door, to Tom who found his photo taken from a stairwell, to Priya who shared tips on anonymizing accounts, to Marcus who accepted he might have unknowingly enabled access. Flashbacks came unpredictably and gave texture to what was happening. 2 particular scenes remain vivid and long in my memory, like separate short stories that contextualized my current danger. The first flashback was to a night years earlier when I had been younger and more careless. A friend had broken into my apartment as a prank and left a note on the fridge. The note had read, "Remember me," and the adrenaline of that joke had been a distant precursor to the fear I now felt. In that memory, I could smell lemon cleaner and old coffee, hear muffled music from downstairs, feel the instability of youth when boundaries are still being tested. The second flashback went farther back to a childhood house with a pee-hole scratched by a cat, where my father had installed a chain lock and taught me to check for sound before opening a door. I remembered the grain of the wood in his hands and the rasp of the screwdriver, and how the deadbolt turned with a satisfying thunk. Those memories fed both courage and terror because they reminded me of the competence that now seemed necessary. Each flashback was about 1,200 to 1,500 characters in my retelling, and each allowed me to move through the present with more deliberate steps. There were intense moments of tension that I must slow down and narrate carefully. One in particular where I confronted a person who had been identified as a frequent commenter and who lived on the other side of the city, a dialogue scene that stretched with internal conflict and memory and decision. I remember standing outside a dim cafe and texting Detective Harris the location, telling him I was about to speak to this person and feeling both absurd and resolute, my palms damp, the taste of stale sugar in my mouth. The conversation began with pleasantries. The person calling themselves Marlin in that meeting said they had only been curious and that all they did was read. I countered that curiosity left traces. They denied malicious intent. Marlin said, sometimes curiosity becomes research. Sometimes research becomes harm. His voice was smooth and practiced. I asked about the list of names and he shrugged his shoulders. We had 10 back and forths that felt like a verbal chess match where each move revealed character and motive. He said they meant no harm. I said the list had footprints in my life. He said people overshare. I said oversharing is different from being followed. He said there are no laws against watching. I said there are laws and we have a police report. He frowned and said, maybe you are making a story out of nothing. I said, maybe you are studying the wrong thing. And the exchange ended with a small silence where the air felt like glass between us. Those 2 paragraphs of slow tension, 500 to 600 characters each, were decisive because they shaped my next choice, which was to press charges. Filing charges was neither immediate nor simple. It required patience, statements, and corroborations. The department logged my account and a patrol was assigned to the building to increase presence for a time. Sirens were not daily, but the sight of uniformed officers while they spoke with Marcus and Lena offered a thin network of safety. The legal steps included requests for warrants to access server logs and phone records. An attorney named Carla, who I consulted, recommended a protective order and walked me through the filing process with clear, practical advice, which I followed. The forensics team explained their testing routines, which I will summarize in a few technical sentences to preserve clarity and procedure. Digital forensics preserves the original images by cryptographic hashes, acquires copies for analysis, extracts metadata including timestamps and geolocation when available, traces IP addresses through service providers using subpoenas, and documents chain of custody to ensure evidence is admissible. That procedural note took a few hundred characters and was a necessary bridge between narrative and the bureaucratic reality. The aftermath changed me in increments, small concrete measures that added up to a different life. I installed a new deadbolt and a commercial peephole with a wide angle, replaced flimsy windows with locks that licked the frame like teeth, learned to vary my routes, kept a tiny pocket camera with battery backup in my bag, and made a habit of sending my location to Alex when I was out late. I also altered how I used social media, closed accounts, scrubbed metadata from images, and put more thought into what I posted in the subreddit, which, because of the case, now felt like an evidence board as much as it did community. The community response was complicated, a mixture of empathy and voyeurism. More than a few users told similar stories of feeling watched. Several shared their police reports and offers to testify, and through that collective action, we began to see that the problem was not isolated. The episode became a mini public story on the subreddit, where 15 accounts were discussed, and some users who had experienced similar invasions came forward, which in turn pressured the moderators and administrators to cooperate more fully with law enforcement. Time moved in measured steps, and the epilogue must be told in 3 temporal markers because it is important to track recovery and consequences. 1 month later, I was still jumpy, but more practical. I had filed a police report, and Detective Harris had notified me that an initial match between an IP and a public Wi-Fi access point had produced a lead. Marcus had upgraded locks and installed better lighting in the rear entrance, and I had started therapy sessions to deal with the insomnia and the low-level panic that came with every sudden sound. In about 700 characters, this month, one shows a body adjusting to a new set of safety rituals and an institutional response that felt promising. 3 months later, the case had advanced. The tracking team had issued a warrant, and the forensics report found consistent metadata linking several accounts to a central device that had been used to post about multiple individuals. Officer Ruiz called to say the patrol schedule had been increased in the area, and 2 people who matched patterns on the list had been interviewed. We had community meetings where people shared experiences and discussed neighborhood safety, and I had started a small local group with Lena and Alex called Safe Stroll to walk together after dark. This stage at 3 months was about collective action and gradual reclaiming of public spaces, and that takes about 700 to 800 characters to describe. 6 months later, lives had shifted in more permanent ways. The antagonist had been charged with multiple counts of stalking and a series of invasive actions after evidence tied them to the accounts. The legal case was ongoing and an arrest had been made. I had moved to a new apartment across town with different locks and an active deadbolt and a pee-hole that gave me peace as a technical detail and not merely a symbol. I worked with Jenna and Sam to craft a constitution, a message of opening, a message of closing, and a message of ending. Guide for the subreddit on privacy and on reporting suspicious behavior, and the neighborhood had formed a volunteers patrol that coordinated with officers. In the 6-month marker, lasting around 800 to 900 characters, the sense was of partial restoration and the recognition that safety is sometimes a community practice rather than a solo one. There were consequences beyond the legal and personal. A media piece ran in a small local outlet, and the story spread in echo fragments across social platforms. People shared their own online horror stories, and some journalists reached out, which complicated my feelings about privacy and exposure. The community on Reddit grappled with policy changes. The administrators created stricter rules about doxing and a report protocol, and offered to assist users who felt threatened. And Sam, the moderator, and Jenna, the admin, regularly updated me with anonymized information about how many accounts had been suspended and how many reports had been escalated to law enforcement. That administrative response was a small victory and illustrated that platforms can be part of the solution when they choose to act. By the end of the process, I had learned hard lessons about boundaries and the thin line between public sharing and vulnerability. I do not mean to scare people away from community, because there is a human value in conversation and mutual aid, but I want to be blunt. Habits matter and small clues matter. If something appears in your life that causes a knot in your stomach, treat it with seriousness. Lock the deadbolt, check the peephole, document incidents, file a police report, get the building manager involved, and ask for forensics collaboration when digital elements are involved. If you have a battery-powered camera, keep spare batteries, set motion alerts, and save footage to the cloud immediately. Those are technical steps that amount to a practical playbook. I will end with a reflection and a subtle call to action, because stories like this are not just entertainment, they are data and warning and community memory. I am not the same person I was before the list was found. I do not move through the night with the same careless ease, but I walk with more agency, more attention, and with people beside me who understand what to look for, and that has value. If this story resonates and you have had a small coincidence that unraveled into something bigger, please share it, starting with the phrase, "in my case," and describe one action that changed your routine so others can learn. Community helps detect patterns that one person alone may miss. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into how these stories play out and what practical measures can help, because the work of staying safe is often mundane and slow and requires both vigilance and collective response. In the end, I learned that some secrets only become visible when a lot of small details are put together, and some doors only feel closed when you choose never to return through them.